It was a regular Thursday morning in Los Angeles. Morgan Freeman, the legendary actor, sat comfortably on a morning talk show. The host, Olivia Sanders, smiled warmly and asked him about his latest film. The audience applauded softly, enjoying the familiar calm of his deep voice. But then, something unexpected happened. Olivia paused, then reached under her seat and pulled out a plain brown envelope. She handed it to Morgan, saying it was from President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The mood instantly shifted. Silence took over the room. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. Morgan held the envelope carefully, almost like it was something sacred. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. As Morgan began to read, his expression changed. His smile faded. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked. He tried to read aloud. To the voice that carried our stories when we were forgotten. To the man who brought dignity to our pain with every word spoken. His hand started to shake. A tear slid down his cheek. You didn't just act, you healed. You didn't just narrate, you resurrected our dignity. The audience sat still. Olivia didn't interrupt. She knew something profound was happening. Morgan continued, voice trembling. I'm writing from a country many have overlooked, but not you. In your voice, we heard ourselves. In your roles, we saw our fathers, our hopes. But he couldn't go on. He stopped reading, lowered the letter into his lap, and covered his face with both hands. The room was silent. The man who had voiced so many stories of pain and triumph was now overcome by his own emotions. All because of a letter from a president few people had even heard of. A quiet sob came from someone in the audience. A woman wiped tears from her eyes. A man next to her held his chest, visibly moved. Morgan slowly tried to compose himself, using a handkerchief to wipe his face. I wasn't ready for this, he whispered. This is different. He looked at Olivia, his eyes still full of emotion. I've received awards, standing ovations, honorary degrees, but no letter, no gesture has ever done this to me. Olivia reached for his hand, not as a host, but as a fellow human being feeling the weight of the moment. Then she turned to the camera and said softly, you just witnessed something real, something rare, a message from one leader to another across oceans, across time. Backstage, producers remained frozen. No one dared cut to commercial.online. The moment was already spreading. People shared the video clip with one simple caption, Morgan Freeman cries on live TV, and we cried with him. That night, Morgan couldn't sleep. The letter stayed on his nightstand, resting under the soft glow of a lamp. He read it over and over again, each time slower, more thoughtful. There was a paragraph he had not read out loud, too personal, too intense. I grew up in a small village in northern Burkina Faso. We had no running water, no electricity, but once a month, a truck would arrive with a generator and a projector. And on that night, we watched movies. Morgan paused for a moment, placing his hand over his chest. Then he said quietly, the first voice I ever heard in English was yours. He added that even though he couldn't understand the words back then, he could feel the emotions behind them. Tears began to well up in his eyes again. The following morning, Morgan contacted the producers of the show and told them he wanted to return and finish reading the letter on air, although it wasn't part of the show's schedule or his promotional tour. The overwhelming response from viewers, millions of views overnight, made the producers agree. Morgan would come back to complete what had started, but neither he nor anyone watching was ready for what was about to unfold. The studio was packed. Every camera was ready. There was no background music, no grand introduction, just silence. Morgan Freeman walked onto the stage holding the letter. He brought no script, no teleprompter, just his heart. Olivia, the host, greeted himself. He nodded, looked out at the audience, and began speaking. He said this letter wasn't just written for him, it was for everyone. Then he read aloud. From the next part, the letter spoke of how, when his author became a soldier, he carried Morgan's words in his heart. Hope is a thing with feathers. It quoted a line Morgan had once recited. The author had remembered those words every night in the forest. The entire room turned quiet again. The letter continued, saying that Morgan's voice gave him courage. And now Now he was leading a nation still struggling to breathe. But he hadn't forgotten the voice that gave him back his name. At those words, Olivia gasped soft. Morgan looked up, visibly overwhelmed. He asked, How does a man respond to something like this? People watching from home were crying. Social media exploded with emotional reactions. One viewer wrote that this wasn't just a letter, it was a mirror to the soul. And yet, the letter still wasn't finished. The most powerful part hadn't even been read. Just as Morgan began folding the letter, a small photo slipped out and landed on the floor. He slowly bent to pick it up. It was a black and white image of a barefoot boy standing in front of a torn bedsheet stretched between the sticks, acting as a makeshift movie screen. Behind him, other children sat on logs, watching a scene of Nelson Mandela being portrayed on the screen. Morgan stared at it and whispered, That's me. That's from Invictus. Olivia leaned closer and quietly told him, You were there. Hero. Morgan turned the photo over. On the back, someone had written in careful handwriting, This is the night I decided I would one day help my people, and your voice gave me the dream. The studio fell into complete silence. Even the camera crew was wiping their eyes. Then Morgan turned toward the live camera and said, President Traoré, if you are watching, please know this, your letter changed. It reminded me why I ever stepped in front of a camera. Backstage, producers were getting overwhelmed with calls from major networks. People weren't just watching the show, they were feeling something. And millions around the world were waiting to see what would happen next. While news of the letter was making headlines globally, a quiet and heartfelt request was sent from Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, to Los Angeles. President Traoré had asked to meet Morgan Freeman in person. No press, no interviews, just a private meeting between two men, one who told stories through film, and another who had lived those stories in reality. At first, Morgan wasn't sure. His schedule was full, and his emotions were still raw. But something about the letter refused to leave his mind. Just 3 days after the broadcast, Morgan boarded a plane. His destination, Burkina Faso. During the flight, he stared out the window, still holding the folded letter. To himself, he whispered, I need to look this man in the eye. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, social media continued to erupt. Hashtags like hashtag the letter that broke Freeman and hashtag TRAORE and Morgan were trending, but none of them knew what was truly about to unfold. This wasn't just a trip, it was a journey that would uncover something deeply buried in Morgan's past, something he had never shared publicly, and it all traced back to one dusty village, a small projector screen, and a boy with a dream. When the jet finally touched down in Burkina Faso, the sun was just beginning to rise. There was no crowd or red carpet waiting, just a single official car and a translator named Allah. During the ride, Allah spoke softly to him. The translator, Allah, looked at Morgan gently and said, The president doesn't usually show this side of himself to others, but your letter, it meant everything to him. Morgan turned toward her, confused. Why me? She smiled softly and replied, Because you gave him hope at a time when hope was hard to find. As they drove through the countryside, the car passed through quiet villages slowly coming to light. Women were seen carrying pots of water, children walked barefoot toward school, and men fixed broken bicycles by the side of the road. It was a world both unfamiliar and deeply human, raw and real. When they finally arrived at the presidential residence, President Ibrahim Traoré was already waiting outside. He wasn't wearing any suit or medals, just a plain shirt, calm eyes, and a quiet presence. Morgan stepped out of the car slowly. The two men looked at each other. No words were exchanged, just a deep, respectful silence, then a mutual nod. The president stepped forward, holding an old photograph. He asked gently, Do you remember this boy? Morgan took the photo. It was the same black and white picture from before, but now clearer. His eyes fixed on the boy's face. Something stirred inside him. This child, Morgan said soft, He looks like my cousin. Ibrahim gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said, He wasn't just watching you, he was waiting for you inside the residence. The president guided Morgan to a peaceful garden. No guards followed. No aides stood nearby, just the two of them under the shade of a large tree. Then the president began to speak, not as a head of state, but as a man remembering his boyhood. After my father died, he said quietly, I lost everything, but I found something again. I found a new father and a voice. a voice that told stories, a voice that gave dignity to people like us. Morgan remained quiet, hands slightly trembling. Then Ibrahim leaned forward and said something he had never shared publicly. "There's something I've never told anyone before. I had a brother. His name was Kosi, and he looked just like you." Morgan's breath caught in his throat. He replied, "I had a cousin named Kosi. We lost him. No one ever found out where he went." Ibrahim opened a folder and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a young Kosi standing beside a younger version of Ibrahim, both smiling wide. Morgan froze, his eyes locked on the image. "We shared stories about you every night," the president said quietly, "until the day he disappeared." Suddenly, this wasn't just about a letter anymore. It was about something deeper, about family, history, pain. The past wasn't just visiting, it was reaching out for healing. And Morgan realized that his journey had only just begun. He walked slowly beside President Traoré through a small, quiet village outside the capital. Children waved as they passed. Not realizing the heavy emotions both men were carrying, they stopped near a faded brick wall. The president pointed toward a small, faint carving etched into the surface. It simply read, "Cozy Freeman." Morgan stood still. He whispered that was the name he used after he left America. Ibrahim nodded. "He said he wanted to keep your family name to honor you." Morgan knelt down beside the wall, brushing it gently with his fingers. The letters had been carved long ago, but they were still visible. That name had stayed, even as time moved on. "He always said he wanted to become like you," Ibrahim said, "but he couldn't go back." Morgan's voice cracked. White Ibrahim turned away for a moment. There was something he felt ashamed of, something he never told. He believed the Freeman name deserved more than what he had become. Morgan's eyes welled up. He whispered, "He was just a boy." The air grew heavy. This wasn't just a story now. It was a return to grief, to questions that had never been answered, but also to a chance, perhaps the last chance for healing. President Traoré then led Morgan to a small, aged building. It was quiet and worn, a single-room house that stood silently in the midday heat. "This," the president said softly, "was Kosi's room. We never touched it. It's still the way he left it." Morgan stepped inside slowly. Dust floated in golden beams of light streaming through the cracked window. On a small wooden shelf were old VHS tapes, books written in English, and a torn photograph. Morgan, smiling, on the set of Lean on Me. Beside it sat a journal. Morgan opened the journal, and his hands trembled as he looked at the first page. The words written there shook him to the core. "To my cousin Morgan, whom I love more than he'll ever know. I didn't run away. I was taken, but I stayed because here I was needed." Tears slid down Morgan's face. He realized that Kosi hadn't just vanished, he had been kidnapped from America. When he was a teenager, somehow, after escaping, he had chosen not to return. President Traoré spoke soft, explaining, "He taught me English. He taught many of us. He helped build this village's school. He saved lives." Morgan sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, speechless. He had mourned his cousin for years, thinking he was gone forever. But now, he was discovering that Kosi hadn't just survived, he had become a hero. That night, Morgan sat alone under the stars, clutching the journal to his chest. It was more than paper. It was a piece of Kosi's heart. President Traoré joined him quietly, holding another envelope in his hands. "This one," the president said gently, "was meant for you. Kosi wrote it, but he never mailed it. He gave it to me before he passed." Morgan felt his breath catch. With trembling fingers, he opened the fragile envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, aged but clean, preserved with care. "Dear Morgan," it began, "I still hear your voice in my dreams. When things got hard, I thought about your roles, your power, your strength. I didn't come back because I was scared you'd forgotten me, but I never forgot you." Morgan closed his eyes as the words sank in deeply. "You gave me the courage to stay and help. I may have disappeared from your world, but you never disappeared from mine. I hope one day you'll come here and see what your voice helped build. With love, your little brother." Sigh. That was the moment Morgan broke. He wept not from shame, but from a tangled mixture of gratitude, pain, and love. For the first time in decades, the silence he had carried in his heart was gone. But he knew the journey wasn't finished yet. Later, that night, Morgan and Traoré sat quietly in the courtyard under a dim lantern. The letter from Kosi rested on Morgan's lap, as though his cousin had just spoken. Then President Traoré added gently, "Kosi never stopped helping even after he fell ill. Morgan looked up, alarmed. He was sick. Traoré nodded. Malaria. He refused to leave the village. He said his story had to end where it started with the people. Morgan tried to hold back tears. He died here. The president silently handed him another item of faded photo. Kosi was smiling weakly in the picture, surrounded by children holding books. He taught them to read using your movie scripts, Traoré said with a soft smile. Shawshank Redemption. Invictus. They knew every line. Morgan's heart clenched. He had always believed that his greatest legacy was his fame, but now he understood it wasn't the roles he played on screen, it was the hope his voice gave to someone the world had nearly forgotten. In that hope, Kosi had found his purpose. And now, perhaps, Morgan had found his own. But President Traoré had one last surprise, one final promise that had waited years to be fulfilled. The next morning, Morgan was taken deep into a rural village. As the car rolled through the community, children ran alongside it, waving and smiling. Their joy was infectious. Eventually, the car stopped near a narrow, dusty path. In front of them stood a small school building, freshly painted in bright colors. Above the entrance was a hand-carved wooden sign that read, Kosi Freeman Community School for Hope. Morgan raised both hands to his mouth in disbelief. President Traoré stepped beside him and said softly, this school exists because of him and because of you. Morgan walked inside slowly. The walls were covered with children's drawings. A classroom was alive with laughter, and young voices read English words aloud in unison. A teacher approached him with a warm smile and handed him a notebook. Inside were handwritten notes from the students. Dear Morgan Freeman, thank you for making my teacher dream big. Your voice helped us believe. Another one read, Kosi said you were a king. We think you are too. Morgan sat down on a small wooden bench, overwhelmed by emotion. He had never imagined that his legacy would live on here in Burkina Faso, in a school built on love, sacrifice, and brotherhood that had crossed oceans and time. He looked at Traoré and whispered with a trembling voice, you've done more than just lead, Mr. President. You've healed a part of me I never thought could be healed. Morgan said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Before Morgan's return flight home, President Traoré invited him to a small evening gathering. In the village, there were no journalists, no flashing cameras, just people. An old man played gentle music on a kora, while a group of children acted out a scene from Morgan's film, The Bucket List. Their energy made everyone laugh, including Morgan died at the end of the evening. Traoré stood and held a wooden box decorated with traditional West African designs. He opened it carefully and took out a medal. Holding it out to Morgan, he said, this isn't from the government. It's from the people, for the man who gave us a voice before we ever had one. Morgan was left speechless in that moment. He didn't feel like an actor or a celebrity. He simply felt like a man who had unknowingly touched lives in a place he never even imagined. As the stars shimmered above them, Morgan whispered a prayer under his breath for Kosi, for the children, for Traoré. Thank you, he said, voice trembling. Traoré gave him a soft smile. No, thank you. And with that moment, a wound that had remained open inside Morgan for decades finally began to close. But the story wasn't over yet. When Morgan returned home to the United States, he carried something with him, something that would soon touch the entire world. 3 days later, Morgan appeared on the show 60 Minutes for what was originally planned as a short segment about his trip to Africa. But when the cameras began rolling, something unexpected happened. Morgan gently placed Ibrahim Traoré's letter on the table in front of him. This, he said with a cracking voice, this is the most powerful letter I've ever read in my life. He paused, took a deep breath, then began reading aloud a part of the letter that hadn't been shared publicly before. Dear Morgan, you have unknowingly mentored millions in Africa. Your voice reached my people before any government aid ever did. When we had no electricity, your words still played through old radios powered by hope. Morgan stopped reading. His voice broke. His eyes filled with tears. And then, in a whisper, he said, he called me a light, but he doesn't know. He became mine. The studio fell completely silent. No cuts. No scripts, just one man's raw emotion filling the screen. Within hours, that clip went viral. Millions watched, millions wept. But most importantly, millions now knew the name Ibrahim Traoré and why one heartfelt letter could shake the world. The days that followed, the response was overwhelming. Major news outlets shared the story. The names Freeman and Traoré began trending around the globe. Schools requested copies of the letter to read aloud in class. Oprah, deeply moved by the broadcast, called it a masterclass in Humanity. Morgan's inbox filled with messages from across the world, from teachers in South Africa, youth leaders in Brazil, even a prison chaplain in the U.S. They all said the same thing. This letter didn't just speak to Morgan Freeman. It spoke to all of us. Donations started pouring in to support the Kosi Freeman School in Burkina Faso. Within just 48 hours, enough money was raised to build 3 more schools in nearby villages. And then, another surprise arrived. President Ibrahim Traoré released a short video. He wore no suit, stood beside no flags, just him, standing next to school children beneath a setting sun. This is not a story about one man, he said calmly. It's about all of us, about choosing compassion even when no one is watching. Let's build more light together. His words echoed around the globe. He hadn't asked for attention, but the world gave it to him anyway, not as a politician, but as a humble servant of the people. 1 week after reading the letter on 60 Minutes, Morgan Freeman returned to his quiet home in Mississippi. He carefully placed the letter in a glass frame above his writing desk. But he didn't stop there. He announced the launch of a new foundation, the Kosi Project, Stories That Heal. Its mission was to fund education and storytelling initiatives in underserved African communities. The first official partner, the Office of the President of Burkina Faso. And in the foundation's very first live stream event, Morgan looked directly into the camera and said, "I used to think my greatest legacy was on film, but I was wrong. It was in a letter from a man who saw the world not as it is, but as it could be." Then he smiled gently and added, "And it all began with a boy named Kosi and a leader named Ibrahim Traoré." The screen slowly faded to black, and the last image appeared, a single candle being passed from one child to another, across borders and continents. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us what part moved you the most. Was it the letter, the school, the tears? Let's fill the comments with light. Let's carry this legacy forward. And remember, sometimes the smallest letter can spark the biggest change.